Good evening. Welcome to a very important program of the International Grapevine. Tonight in the International Grapevine, we want to talk a little bit about understanding plea bargain, how it works, how the court feels about it, and most importantly, how it applies to certain individuals that are in the system, whether they're guilty or not. Our research has shown us that plea bargain it's important to a certain extent, but also unfortunately, certain people plead guilty even though they are not guilty because they don't understand the system in some cases, and in some cases they don't have proper legal representation. Tonight in the International Grapevine, we want to talk about those sensitive issues, how it works, the pros and the cons of it. We're extremely pleased today to have on our show a very gifted and professional attorney by the name of Sally Attia, who has been kind enough to be our guest in the program. Ms. Attia, welcome to our program.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Obviously, it's good to have you. We heard wonderful things about you, and we want to take this opportunity to talk a little bit about things I mentioned at the beginning of the program, how it worked. I wanted to ask you, how widespread is plea bargain in the legal system today?
It's extremely widespread. So, I guess let's make sure people know what we're talking about. So, what is
Mm.
plea bargaining? So, plea bargaining happens when somebody's charged with a crime. Usually, the prosecutors charge them with the maximum they can charge them with, and then they make them an offer after they've been arraigned and seen a judge to settle the case, to reach an agreement. That's the plea bargain. And usually it's to a lesser charge with usually a much lesser sentence. And so, how often does it happen? Research shows about 90 to 95% of cases, more or less, end in plea bargains. About 2% of cases get dismissed, and then about 2% of cases go to trial.
Very interesting indeed. Our research tells us a lot of mixture in the plea bargain. Um, it's considered in some cases, we'll go back and forth. Some guys are considered guilty because of not understanding the system. And as you mentioned, in some circumstance, how a plea bargain works. Concern has always been if he's not guilty, why is pleading guilty? Um, why something like that will happen sometimes? Lack of knowledge, lack of representation, or a combination of both.
I think it's a combination of a lot of different things. Um, so you'd ask, why would a prosecutor first offer a plea bargain? They have too many cases, it's an easier way to get rid of them. Um, the courts are congested, maybe, and it's a quicker way to resolve a case. You've got a public defender, a government free paid attorney who has way too many cases on their docket, and they need to get cases off their docket, or they don't have time to study your case in depth at length, to talk to you and meet with your witnesses. That's an option too. Might be too expensive to hire a private attorney. It could be that it's too risky to go to trial. Like I said, usually the charges you're charged with are a lot more severe and carry a lot worse sentences than a plea bargain would. I think I actually have a statistic about that here. Um, so it's an old statistic. It's not current because it's. I think that's the last time they did this. But in 2012, the average sentence of a convicted felon after trial was 16 years, but with a plea, only 5.5. So if I have a defendant and they're asking me that, and I give them these statistics, the risks are quite severe of going to trial. And then getting to the trial takes a lot of time as well. So I can resolve a case with a plea bargain in 6 months. It'll take me at least a year and a half to take it to trial. So there are lots of reasons.
I couldn't agree with you more. Our research tells us that the court system is really packed and full, and they want to get going and move fast with these cases. And in some cases, things cross. The guy who is shown as guilty is not actually guilty. His lack of experience, lack of seeking the proper attorney to defend him. If you have the proper attorney and you have the funds to back it up in some cases, you might have a better chance. My next question is, if this person who's not guilty but pleads guilty, after going to jail, and he gets another attorney to come back into the case to fight the case in a different manner, or once he plead guilty, that's it?
So, a lot of times with a plea bargain, part of the agreement is that you waive your right to appeal.
Wow.
So, that happens a lot of the time. Now, you may not waive every single right to appeal, but you waive most of your rights to appeal. And so, chances are that if you chose to plead guilty, chances are you're not going to be able to appeal it and take it back.
Understand, but it's also very, very scary because obviously in the plea bargain, he's been told this is it. Once you accept, you're in, and there's no return. Um, on the other hand, it it's kind of tough when you think about the, the poor community, the uneducated person, um, the person that doesn't have the means and the ability. Not they're stupid, but they don't understand the system, and they fall into these type of things. And down in the road, we'll talk about coercing for a plea bargain. But I want to emphasize that the court system, it's good in one way, but it seems that it is so crowded and so stuck with so many different cases that all of these things in between an attorney and the guy who's pressing the charge is the easiest way to go to solve the matter. And let's move on to the next case if it's humanly possible. So it also shows to a certain extent whether accept it or don't want to accept it. The court system has a little bit pinch that is not as smooth as we think it is. And I'm only basing that on research. I could be wrong.
So the courts are under an obligation to move cases along. They have like deadlines and statistics that are being taken on a regular basis. How many cases have you resolved? How many cases have reached disposition finished? How many cases have been lingering? How long have they been lingering? And so, yeah, there are time pressures placed on the courts. And it takes, in this case, three to tango. You need the prosecutor, you need the defendant, and you need the court to be all on board. And the easiest thing for most of the courts is if the prosecutor and the defendant can reach an agreement, then the court says, why am I going to interfere with that? Yes, I'll accept that offer. And that's what happens a lot of the time. Now, there are certain courts and certain judges that are known for invoking their own personal opinion on whether it's acceptable or not. And only in practice will you learn those judges and which courts do that.
In these type of situation, what picture does the judge play? He hears both sides. He might see a little hesitant on the other side to pleading guilty. What picture does he play? Or once he listens to both attorney, he makes a decision.
So, really, the way it's usually presented is the prosecution will say, we've made an offer and the defendant will accept it. And then the judge has to go through some protocol questions to ask um, if the defendant is pleading guilty voluntarily and willingly. And then he asks the defendant, isn't it true that on such date? And the judge states the elements of the crime. If the defendant doesn't unequivocally say, yes, I am guilty, and yes, I committed these crimes, the judge shouldn't, and depending on the court again, usually wouldn't accept the plea. They need to hear the defendant say definitively, yes, I am guilty and I committed these elements that prove that I did this crime. And usually, when judges, where the defendant hesitates and says, well, I'm not guilty, but I'm going to say I'm guilty, the judge will tell the attorney to take a minute, go talk to your client, and then come back on the record when your client's ready to actually say he's guilty, period.
Very interesting indeed. Very interesting indeed. No question about it. We stumble on a lot of things on, and I don't want to go on forever. But one thing that sticks in my mind: how important it is for a defendant to get a good criminal attorney to represent them. How
Well,
important it is.
I mean, I'm probably extremely biased, and I admit it. I am a defense attorney, and I've seen really poor advice given to clients in the past. So, in my opinion, it's extremely important. I mean, the fact is, for example, I deal with a lot of clients who are immigrants or intending immigrants, and criminal consequences can have severe ramifications on your immigration status. And I am on a regular basis filing motions with criminal courts to vacate their criminal pleas because of the resulting immigration consequences thereafter. But again, for immigration purposes, one has to be careful because you can't vacate a criminal plea only for immigration purposes. So there's a really fine line as a defense attorney that we have to walk if we're going to even try to vacate a plea.
How difficult is it to vacate a plea?
That's a tough question. It's very fact specific. It depends on when you took the plea, why you took the plea, what evidence was there against you, which court you took the plea in, what are the consequences. There are so many things that one has to consider. Part of what we have to look at is what the judge and what your attorney said during your plea and sentence. It's a complicated matter that has to be evaluated on a case by case basis.
I couldn't agree with you more. But it's important to note that most minorities in the system or out of the system feel, in most cases, that the court system is not fair to them. I can't explain and actually explain that, but you read in the papers, you see it in the news. I got railroaded, uh, and stuff like that. And that's one of the reasons why I asked you, what picture does the judge play? And I like the explanation that you gave. But most legal situation, no matter how you take it, for someone who's found guilty or is about to be found guilty, is very complex. And there's a lot of wires going in different direction. And the guy who's brought into court is obviously nervous, especially the first time he ever been to court. And we have found in some cases the court system is so loaded that some of us feel that the court system is broken. It hasn't given the properly based situation because it's so loaded with so many different cases that their hands are full. And if someone doesn't have the proper legal representation and is probably silly enough to plead guilty because of fear, they fall into the system. And once they're locked up, as we just mentioned, getting them out is like pulling teeth without Novocaine. Very difficult situation. And it seems to happen a lot.
So, I've looked at a lot of different criminal legal systems around the world,
Mhm.
and I would say that the US criminal legal system is probably, in my opinion, by far the best that exists.
Okay.
With that being said, that doesn't mean that we don't have problems. It just means we're better than what's worse, right? Um, but beyond just the judges, you know, the charges are brought against you by the prosecutor, by the district attorney's office. The head of each county's district attorney's office is an elected official. It's somebody that the people voted to be the district attorney or the head prosecutor, usually, in most places. Sometimes they're appointed by an elected official, but they're the ones that bring the charges to begin with. They're the ones that decide how high the original charges are. And if you're starting up here and you want a plea bargain, it's harder to get down here if you start up here. If the original charges were up here, maybe you'd be able to plea bargain even lower, where you can't even see my hand on the screen now. So judges play an important role. The prosecutors play an important role, and the people who elect these people into office play an important role. And so we're all responsible for the system and how it's working or not working.
Obviously, the court
And those,
system is extremely complex, very complex, and in many ways. One of the cases that always jump out of my mind is the five kids that got railroaded into a rape situation that took place in Central Park. Obviously, the police department, no matter how we cut it, coerced on a situation for them to plead guilty. Even one of their parents was forced into that. And in reality, these five young men, I'm not saying they're any angel, but they went to prison for absolutely no reason for over 6, 7 years, and they were not guilty. We even know a big mouth put out a newspaper ad that they should have really gotten the electric chair, and they didn't have the integrity to apologize to them when they came out. So when we talk about the system, the court system, and stuff like that, how widespread, and you're not into the police department, sometimes a course guilty is done on an individual, whether it be a man or woman. What does your ears tell you in terms of that?
so I don't know the statistics on it. I don't know if that, I don't know how you would actually do the research, right? It would be a very difficult thing to research to know for sure, because a lot of people claim they're not guilty, even though we know sometimes they really are guilty, right?
Agree. Agree.
Uh, so, how you would tally those statistics would be really hard to do. Um, I like to believe in our system. It's not perfect, and things go wrong a lot. But I think we're working as hard as we can to keep it a good system. People ask me, how can you be a defense attorney knowing you're representing people who've committed some heinous crimes? And I tell them, if the prosecutor does their job and the police do their job and the judge does their job and the jury does their job, then, and I do my job, then the best result usually comes out. And so it's a risky situation, it's a scary situation, and the problem is not everybody was going to get my experience and my time and my representation, like you said. And therein lies our really big problems. There are socioeconomic and race factors that we know play a major role in plea bargains. And I think that's what you are focusing on. And I think we need more funding for public defenders. You need more money to support them to be able to provide the time to provide legal support. Everybody asks me, are private lawyers better than public defenders? And no, there are excellent public defenders. The problem is they have too many cases on their plate, and they don't have the time to dedicate to each and every case. And the reality is, if you've got a record once, then it's going to be easier to get a record a second time. And then you become a predicate, and then your record just happens to like snowball. an avalanche, and in the end, you're a career criminal. And maybe it didn't have to be that way, but
It's
that's what.
ironic that you mentioned that. Our understanding, the critique has always been very tough on public defenders that have been supposedly by some people acknowledged have been very weak. Public defenders who have not been prepared on a case that they go to court to represent a certain client. Public defenders, just like you say, in some cases they're really truly loaded, but the newspaper, the media, uh, publicly sometimes present them as weak and not having all the information necessary to back their client. Um, what do you think about those type of rumors?
I think it's those are reasonable things to say because public defenders' caseloads are incredible. And when people ask me, "Wow, why do you charge so much?" Because I'm not going to work on anybody else's case when I'm working on your case. So my time needs to be dedicated to you. And so you are paying for me to focus all my energy and power and brain power and ability on figuring out the best path for you. And public defenders don't have that luxury.
Understood. And we'll be right back on International Grapevine talking about plea bargain, talking about the legal system, the pros, the cons, the things that some people go through, even though in some cases they're not guilty, but they don't have the ability, they don't have proper legal representation in some cases. And in some cases, they really doesn't have the knowledge. We'll be right back on International Grapevine. And we're back here in International Grapevine talking about plea bargain, the pros and cons of it, and talking about the court system, which is loaded with a lot of work and stuff like that, and the responsibility of the court system of moving things, and also the responsibility of attorneys representing the clients and stuff like that. Make no mistake about it, if we go from state to state, most minorities, whether they be Latino, black, or brown people, feel that the court system have failed a lot of them. And in some cases, it's very, very true. The things that happen to them, how they are arrested, how they are brutalized in the system. And yet, still, when they get in front of the judge, none of these things are brought up. And in some cases, if you go back and read the papers, some guys have got arrested many years ago, even though they were innocent. And lo and behold, after spending 15, 20, 30 years in prison, because of pressure from the newspapers and pressure from great, good attorneys to go back and review the case, found out that the guys that was in jail for so long, okay, was actually innocent. And, how do you recover from a situation like that to be put in prison for such a long time for something that you didn't do? However, by the same token, there have been a lot of criminal cases, guys who got away for a long time and they were apprehended and put behind bars where they really truly belong for the crime that they did and for the things that they did. So it's very complex, the things that we're talking about. But we feel obligated to have the opportunity to talk about this, to educate our clients, for them to see the pros and cons and know certain rights that they have. And, we take this opportunity to have this wonderful young lady who was an attorney and a very good one at that to be on our program, and we were very kind and appreciated the fact that she's been here to spend some time talking about these important things and how the system works and the importance of the system. And we don't have words to thank her for being our guest and for laying it on the line the way she see how it is and what it is. Sally, as we continue to talk, there's one part I want to read to you. You said in state after state, including New York City, where 20 to 25 people who plead guilty yet they were innocent, were black, brown, or people of darker color. They bear the brunt of the policies that coerce pleas. What do you
It's
think?
true. I mean, there's no question it's true. We know, we've been fighting this for years. People of color, minorities, get arrested substantially more than their white counterparts. We know that after the arrest, there are charges that are substantially higher for minorities. And we know, at least in federal courts, statistically, that minorities end up with 19% longer sentences than their white counterparts. So we know that the system has major problems. And I know there are lots of people out there working to fight it. And it starts with the types of crimes that people are being arrested for, the leniency cops give to certain people versus others. I mean, a really good example of this is when the federal government decided that they were going to set mandatory minimum sentences on crack cocaine and didn't set mandatory minimum sentences on regular cocaine. And that's really interesting because crack cocaine is significantly cheaper, used by the poorer people, and tend to be used primarily by black people, whereas cocaine is very expensive and it's used mostly by rich white people. And then you go back and say, well, they're the same substance, so why are the sentencing guidelines different? And those are good questions. So a lot of people got locked up based on these rules that were brought down by the federal government. And who is the federal government? It's the people you elect to Congress. So I keep going back to it. It's a cycle, and we're all a part of it, and we're all party to it. And we're not in election season now, but this is something to keep in mind when elections come up. Who are you voting for? Because what they're doing trickles all the way down to that little kid who lives in the projects and what their future is going to look like.
I couldn't agree with you more with what you're saying, which are really truly facts that we have seen on TV, we've seen in the news. Um, the term is always on the minorities. Yes, if they commit a crime, they should go to jail. But some of the things that are being done to them by the police department in some case when they're arrested, and in some cases by the system, the judicial system, the way how it works against them, how it's balanced versus a guy that is rich or have money to live in Jersey versus a guy that live in East New York and stuff like it. It's staggering. It's scary. And these are the same people that sit at the breakfast table and critique minorities when they're a major part of the problem with their racist behavior. It's staggering, but we'll move on. Uh, what
Can I
exactly does? Yeah, no, go ahead.
let me add this? So it's not that nobody's trying to do anything. We know everybody's trying to do everything about it. In fact, there was a massive bail reform done here in New York in the past couple of years, right? Where bail requirements were changed drastically. Why? Because minorities, poor people, were generally the ones paying the harshest consequences of the bail laws as they stood. And the reason was they'd get arrested and judges would set bail, and people who had minor crimes or who didn't have the means were getting stuck behind bars. And this takes us back to plea bargains. When you're in jail and you're behind bars and you get offered a plea bargain that results in you getting out of jail and the end is in sight, sometimes you're going to take that plea bargain just to get out of jail because you're
Yeah.
tired of being in there, even though you may not be guilty. But that's the reality of it. And the other fact is, if you're in jail behind bars, your plea bargain offer is more likely to include jail time than if you're out. So if you could, back then, afford to get out on bail, it was so important to get out on bail because it would make my job, getting you a plea bargain, so much easier to get you something that didn't involve jail. And that went to your socioeconomic status again. And so this bail reform happened. And for a lot of people, they thought this was amazing and wonderful because these low level crimes that people were getting locked up on and jammed up on with high bails were no longer happening. And now, 2 years down the line, they're seeking new bail reform because they say the pendulum swung too far. Did it swing too far? I don't know. Maybe it has, maybe it hasn't. Maybe it's
Or
just
maybe they're trying to correct it now. Are they trying to correct it, you think?
oh yeah, bail reform is in front of the legislator and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do with it. So the pendulum swung one way and now it's swung the other way, and they're trying to figure out how to make it fair. I'm not saying that the current bail situation is unfair, but it's made a lot of people uncomfortable.
I'm quite sure it has. I'm quite sure it has. Even today's, what happened if a guy's in bail and he skips bail? How does the
Gets
system look at that? They try to find him, I imagine.
yeah, I mean, yeah, he'll get arrested and he'll get charged with um, violating his bail conditions, and they'll see why he did. Sometimes there's a reason. You were in the hospital, you were in an accident, something happened, but each time you don't show up to court, a bench warrant can be issued. It can be stayed, meaning they won't go and execute it and give you a chance to come back to court. And so, about that, the worst thing a defendant can do is not show up to court. That's the absolute worst thing anybody can ever do. You have to deal with the consequences of whether they're your actions or not, but you need to deal with them. Not showing up to court will jeopardize you. If you're innocent, if you're guilty, it will jeopardize your situation so much. So please don't think avoiding going to court should even be an option.
Well, no question about that. Let's just say a lot of guys in that enter into the criminal system. Most of them are not really educated. Most of them, in certain extent, even are ignorant. And I'm not making an excuse for them. You commit a crime, you should pay for it. But it's the way how a guy who stole something, let's say he stole a record or a couple of albums, the way how the system look at him and they put the finger down on him is to put him away for a long time. And that happened a lot in New York City for a while. And that's one of the reasons why we're having a program like this, so people know they have certain rights. But if you're guilty, you're guilty. It's that simple. And I just wanted to be sure how plea bargain is used, and what it, in some cases, it's kind of just kind of abused to a certain extent because we don't have time to deal with it, or the guy doesn't have legal representation in some cases, and that's what happened, and that's a reality. Yeah.
So I don't know that if you're guilty, you're guilty,
Hmm.
right? Um, it's nice to think that, but I plea bargain for clients who've committed crimes, and we work out deals for them as well. We sometimes hope that, maybe being given a second chance because they were ignorant or uneducated or living in a bad situation, that maybe being given a second chance, they'll adjust and correct their path and go down the right path. So, plea bargains aren't only for the innocent, they're also for the guilty. And sometimes people get amazing deals when they've committed pretty bad crimes.
Wow. Wow. Well, I guess it's important the way how it's used to a certain extent, and if it applies to everyone across the board, not the rich person only or the one that have things, which happen a lot in the plea bargain. The big guys who move to fraud a company and stuff like that, they get away with it. Great attorneys, they know the system. very well protected. They go to court one time and they got the plea bargain and stuff like that. The minority got, you know what. Having said that, I want to take this opportunity on behalf of the family of Grapevine to tell you thank you so much for being a special guest, for taking the time out to bring all this information to us, which is very rich in terms of information, knowing your rights, knowing what's good for you, and how you go about things. We don't have words to thank you for being our special guest today, and we really appreciate it. We just hope that you'll give us the opportunity to come back on the grapevine real soon.
Thank you for having me, and it was my pleasure. I really hope people got something out of this. And if people have a pending criminal case here in New York, they should give me a call. Maybe I can help.
Well, we'll reflect the telephone number right there so that they have the opportunity to reach out to you because your response that you gave us were very solid like a rock. And a good attorney like you should be called upon in these type of situations. No question about it.
Thank you.
Yeah. And again, this is Walden Furley saying good night for the International Grapevine, and we hope that this program has been to your liking. We hope to see you next week at the same time, at the same place. Good night.